A billionaire CEO opened his office door, only to find a little girl on the floor begging, "Please help my sister." Matthew Bailey had always been a man of precision, of schedule, of polished timing. His world ran like a machine: meetings, mergers, acquisitions, decisions that could move entire industries. On that particular morning, dressed in his usual light gray tailored suit, dark brown hair slicked neatly back, and sky blue eyes focused, he exited the towering glass doors of his corporate headquarters and prepared to step into his waiting car. The driver stood ready, the black sedan gleaming beneath the overcast sky. Matthew barely looked up from his phone, already reading a briefing for the investor meeting he was headed to. But some movement in the corner of his eye, made him pause. A few steps ahead, near the edge of the building's shadow, he noticed something that didn't belong. It was small, trembling, and crouched. As he moved closer, the shape became clearer. It was a child, no, two children. One was kneeling on the cold concrete, sobbing, her hands gently patting the face of the other, who was lying motionless beside her. Both were little girls, no more than 6 years old, dressed in matching pale blue dresses. Their blonde hair and delicate faces made them look like twins. The one who was conscious turned her tear-streaked face toward him as he approached and spoke in a voice so soft it nearly broke him. "Please help her, sir." Matthew froze. This wasn't a situation he knew how to handle. He wasn't prepared. He was used to boardrooms and numbers, not small, broken voices and unconscious children. But instinct overtook him. Without thinking, he dropped to his knees beside them and checked the second girl's pulse. It was faint, but present. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale and damp with sweat. He gently slipped one arm beneath her knees and the other around her shoulders and lifted her into his arms. She was light, frighteningly so. Turning to the conscious girl, he said firmly but gently, "I'm going to help her. Come with me." Without waiting, he started walking, fast, then faster, toward the hospital just a few blocks away. He didn't bother calling an ambulance. The hospital was close enough, and he didn't want to waste a single second. The little girl ran behind him, trying to keep up, her small footsteps slapping the pavement as she sobbed. Inside the hospital, the front desk nurse's eyes widened the moment Matthew burst through the doors, carrying the limp child in his arms. "Emergency," he said sharply. "She collapsed outside my building." Doctors and nurses swarmed in an instant, wheeling a gurney toward them and transferring the girl with practiced urgency. The nurse knelt down to speak to the other girl, whose name he still didn't know. Matthew didn't leave. He couldn't. He just stood there, his chest heaving, heart racing, hands shaking slightly though he tried to hide it. When the nurse returned a few minutes later to ask for any information, Matthew could only shake his head. "I don't know who they are. They were just there." Eventually, a nurse found a name tag stitched onto the inside of the girl's dress. June. The other girl, sitting quietly in a chair, holding a small stuffed bear, confirmed it with a nod. "That's my sister. I'm Ella." Matthew crouched beside her. "Do you know your mom's name? Can we call her?" Ella nodded again and whispered, "She works at the hospital, but at night." So the girls had been alone. No one knew how or why they had ended up near his office. And still, Matthew couldn't bring himself to leave. He cancelled his meeting. Told his assistant to handle it all. He wasn't going anywhere until he knew June was going to be okay. He sat in the waiting room next to Ella, who curled up in the oversized chair and clutched his sleeve like it was the only steady thing left in her world. For the first time in his life, the CEO who was used to fixing everything felt completely helpless. And yet, something deep inside him stirred, not fear, not regret, but something more dangerous. Attachment. He didn't know these girls. But he already knew he wouldn't forget them. The minutes stretched into hours as Matthew sat silently in the stiff hospital chair beside Ella. The emergency room had slowly emptied out, but he remained, his phone long forgotten in his pocket, his usually restless hands still. Ella had cried herself to sleep with her head resting on his arm, her tiny fingers gripping his sleeve as if letting go would make everything fall apart. The quiet hum of machines and the distant footsteps of nurses were the only sounds that filled the space around them. Matthew couldn't stop staring at the hallway where June had disappeared behind the swinging double doors. Each time a doctor or nurse walked past, he sat up straighter, expecting news, fearing the worst. Eventually, a woman in scrubs came hurrying into the emergency room. Her dark hair was tied back, her face pale, her eyes wild with panic. She spotted Ella instantly and ran toward her. "Ella," she cried, falling to her knees and scooping the little girl into her arms. Ella woke up and clung to her, whispering, "Mommy, June's sick." She fell. Matthew stood, uncertain whether to step forward or give them space. The woman, Lauren, he would soon learn, looked up at him with tears already streaming down her cheeks. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked under the weight of the moment. Matthew hesitated only a second before he gently said, "She's being cared for. She's stable, but she's not conscious. I found them outside my office building." "Ella said you work night shifts." Lauren wiped her eyes with trembling fingers. "I do. I left them sleeping. They've never woken up before I got back." She looked down, shame and fear mingling in her expression. "I was just trying to hold it together. I didn't think." Matthew shook his head, not with judgment, but with the sobering pressure of witnessing something that could have ended tragically. "She needs you now. That's all that matters." A nurse approached them then and spoke quietly to Lauren, guiding her down the hallway. Ella looked back at Matthew, her eyes pleading. "Can he come too?" The nurse hesitated but then nodded. So he followed. The three of them entered the pediatric ICU where June lay small and motionless in a hospital bed, wires and tubes connected to her fragile body. Machines blinked and beeped in slow rhythm. Lauren let out a sound between a sob and a gasp and clutched the rail of the bed, whispering her daughter's name over and over. Matthew stood just behind them, silent, overwhelmed by a mix of helplessness and rage at the world, at how unfair it had been to this woman and her children, at how easily a life could shatter from one missed breath. Later, when the doctors explained the situation, a sudden medical episode, perhaps neurological, but not fully diagnosed, Matthew stayed to listen. Lauren was too shaken to ask questions. He stepped in, asked the hard things, the precise things, the things she couldn't bring herself to voice. He was used to leading, used to handling chaos, but never like this. Not when the stakes were this human. Hours passed. Visiting time ended, but no one asked Matthew to leave. He sat in the corner while Lauren lay her head beside June's and Ella curled up on a bench with a blanket draped over her shoulders. The room dimmed with the late evening light. Matthew didn't leave. He couldn't. He stared at June's pale face and wondered how a child he had never known until today had already carved a place inside his chest. When a nurse finally whispered that they would transfer June to a long-term pediatric observation room the next morning, Lauren looked to Matthew for guidance, her voice hoarse. "What do I do now?" He could have said what anyone else might, go home, rest, let the doctors take over. But instead, he looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just a mother in pain, but a woman on the verge of collapse, trying to carry a life that had never given her room to breathe. So he said, "You let me help." She blinked, uncertain if she had heard him right. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. He simply sat down beside her again and offered his presence, steady and unwavering. By the time the hospital room fell into silence again, with the hum of machines marking the night, Matthew knew something had shifted. He hadn't planned on staying. He hadn't planned on anything beyond the first 5 minutes outside his office. But now, as he watched a sleeping child he barely knew and the family that had accidentally pulled him into their storm, he realized something terrifying and deeply true. He didn't want to leave. The following morning began not with the ringing of alarms or the scent of brewed coffee but with the sterile quiet of a hospital corridor and the distant rhythmic hum of machines. Matthew hadn't left. He had stayed all night, barely shifting in the stiff plastic chair in the corner of June's room. At some point, a nurse had offered him a pillow, which he had politely declined, choosing instead to remain alert. Sleep felt inappropriate, like a luxury he hadn't earned in the face of what was unfolding before him. June's condition remained unchanged. She still lay motionless beneath a thin hospital blanket, her tiny body dwarfed by the sterile bed, her blonde hair fanned out across the pillow. Ella had woken at dawn and sat cross-legged on the bench with her stuffed bear clutched tightly in her arms, her eyes drifting back and forth between her sister and her mother. Lauren, after finally collapsing from exhaustion sometime before sunrise, stirred quietly in the chair beside the bed. Her face was pale, her dark hair messy and tucked behind her ears, and the lines of worry etched around her mouth had only deepened. When she opened her eyes and saw Matthew still sitting there, she looked at him with a mixture of confusion and quiet disbelief. "You didn't go?" she asked, her voice rough from sleep and emotion. Matthew simply shook his head. "I wasn't going to leave you alone in this." It wasn't the kind of thing she was used to hearing. Her shoulders dropped as if some invisible weight had been lifted, even for just a second. No one had ever said that to her, not like that, not and actually meant it. Most people helped out of obligation, or guilt, or pity. But he stayed. A man who owed them nothing had chosen to stay. Later that morning, a doctor came in to explain the results of the tests they had managed to conduct overnight. They still didn't have a concrete diagnosis. It might be a seizure disorder. It could be a rare infection. There were possibilities they needed to eliminate through further testing, but one thing was certain: June would be kept in a controlled environment under close monitoring for the foreseeable future. Lauren asked a few quiet questions, nodded in all the right places, but Matthew could tell her mind was spiraling. He could see it in the way she gripped the edge of her chair, the way her foot tapped against the floor, barely perceptible but constant. When the doctor left, she turned to Matthew and whispered, "I don't have the money for this. I have insurance, but it's not enough. It never is." Matthew didn't respond right away. He didn't want to offend her, didn't want to throw his wealth in her face like a solution she hadn't asked for. But the truth was, she needed help. More importantly, her daughter needed care. So he spoke softly, firmly, and with conviction. "Let me handle the hospital bills. All of them." Lauren stiffened. "I can't let you." "You can," he said, cutting her off gently. "And you should. This isn't charity. It's the right thing to do." She looked away, blinking hard, but didn't argue further. In the afternoon, while June rested, Matthew offered to take Ella outside for some fresh air. The little girl hesitated, not wanting to leave her sister, but Lauren encouraged her, and eventually she agreed. He held her hand as they walked slowly through the hospital garden, a small courtyard with a few benches and neatly trimmed hedges. The air was cool and smelled faintly of flowers. Ella stayed quiet until they sat down. "She's going to wake up, right?" she asked without looking at him. Matthew swallowed the lump in his throat. "Yes. She's strong. Just like you." Ella was quiet for a long moment before she said, "You're nice. Most people don't stay." Matthew didn't know what to say to that. He just reached over and gently squeezed her hand. Later that day, after they returned to the hospital room, Lauren approached him while Ella was coloring quietly near the window. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice low. "You don't have to," Matthew replied. "Just let me stay." Lauren studied him for a moment, searching for an angle, a condition, some hidden reason behind his presence. But there was none. He had seen something in those girls that he couldn't ignore. Maybe it was the fragility of their world. Maybe it was the reflection of something he'd lost long ago and never realized he missed. Or maybe it was as simple as this: sometimes life puts you in the right place not to rescue someone, but to finally rescue yourself. By the fourth day, the sterile whiteness of the hospital no longer felt foreign to Matthew. He had memorized the hallway tiles, the sequence of beeps from the machines, the squeak of nurses' shoes down the corridor. It was a strange kind of familiarity, built not from comfort but from presence. He still returned to his office for short intervals, enough to sign what couldn't be delayed, to make decisive calls his team depended on, and then he'd be right back, sometimes with snacks, sometimes with a book for Ella, sometimes just with the quiet steadiness he knew the family now expected. Ella had warmed to him faster than he expected. They had developed a kind of silent understanding. She no longer asked why he was there, she simply began treating him as if he always had been. She'd bring him her coloring pages to show off, offer him half of her cookies, and rest her head against his side when she got tired in the waiting room. To anyone passing by, they might have looked like a father and daughter waiting out a hard day together. In a way, it wasn't far from the truth. Lauren, on the other hand, remained more guarded. She was polite, even grateful, but her exhaustion hadn't erased her pride. It was in the way she still apologized for needing help, in the way she quietly declined when he tried to do too much, and in the way her eyes searched his face when he spoke, as if trying to decide whether or not she could believe him. And Matthew understood that. He had never been in her position, but he had known what it felt like to rely on no one. Trusting someone who simply appeared in your life with no explanation and no obligation was not easy. Still, she was beginning to soften. Not with words, but with little gestures, letting him help with Ella's meals, letting him take calls from the doctors when she needed rest, leaving him in the room with June when she needed to go home and shower. June remained unconscious, her little chest rising and falling beneath the blanket, her skin pale but peaceful. The doctors remained hopeful, though cautious. There had been no new complications, and her vitals had stabilized. Matthew had asked questions every day, pressed them for details, learned terms he'd never thought he'd need to know. He had turned his obsession with control and outcomes toward her recovery, and this time, the stakes were deeply personal. That afternoon, as the sunlight angled through the narrow hospital window, casting a warm glow over the small room, Lauren sat by June's side while Ella napped on the couch nearby. Matthew brought in 2 cups of tea from the hospital cafe and handed one to her without a word. She took it, murmured thanks, and they sat in silence for a few minutes. Eventually, she broke it. "You don't even know us," she said quietly, staring at her daughter instead of at him. "I know enough," he answered. She shook her head. "You don't know what we've been through. You don't know how hard it's been, how alone I've felt for years. And then you walk in and start, carrying everything like it's yours. Like it's easy." "It's not easy," he said. "And I'm not doing it because I think I can fix your life. I'm here because I care. That's all. No agenda. No reason other than I want to be." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and there was something in her expression that he hadn't seen before, an almost imperceptible flicker of relief. She didn't thank him. She didn't cry. She just nodded once and turned back toward her daughter. Later that night, after Ella had gone home with Lauren for a change of clothes and a hot meal, Matthew stayed behind with June. The room was dim, the machines steady in their rhythm. He sat beside her, holding her tiny hand, and whispered softly, "You don't know me either. But I promise, I'm not leaving." And though she gave no sign of hearing him, he stayed, because it was the only promise he could make that truly mattered. By the 5th day, the hospital had stopped feeling like a place people passed through and started to feel like a world of its own, a strange island where time stretched and blurred and ordinary life didn't seem to exist. For Lauren, every hour dragged with quiet dread, waiting for some sign from June. For Matthew, the days passed with an urgency he hadn't felt since the early years of building his company, but this time there was no strategy, no competition, no metric, just a child lying in a hospital bed and the ache of helplessness when he couldn't control the outcome. June remained still, and though the doctors continued to reassure them that her condition was stable, every unchanged morning felt heavier than the last. Lauren had moved into a rhythm, waking early, bringing Ella to the hospital, sitting for hours at June's bedside, and then returning home late at night only to do it all again. She had refused Matthew's offers to stay in a hotel, saying she couldn't be too far from her daughter. Instead, she rotated sleeping between the hospital recliner and a friend's spare couch. On that morning, while Ella sat near the window organizing stickers into rows and whispering to her stuffed bear, Lauren stepped into the hallway to take a call about a missed utility bill. "Matthew, who had returned just minutes earlier with coffees and fresh fruit, set everything down quietly on the small table and sat beside June again. He stared at her, letting the silence settle around them. Her hand was still so small in his, her skin soft, untouched by the burdens that weighed so heavily on her mother and sister. He didn't speak to her like adults speak to children. He didn't fill the room with false hope or easy promises. Instead, he simply said things aloud as if she were listening, as if his presence could tether her back to the surface. He told her about the lunch he had with a supplier that morning, how they had overcooked the salmon but the server was kind. He told her how he had forgotten to sign a contract the day before and his assistant had laughed because that had never happened before. And he told her that Ella missed her terribly, that her drawings were now full of butterflies and stars and that every one of them had a small stick figure drawn beside them labeled June. Lauren returned and stood in the doorway listening. She didn't interrupt. She watched this man, her accidental stranger, the man who had once stood in boardrooms with stock prices behind him, talk softly to her daughter about stickers and salmon and the sun setting too early. Her chest tightened, not with suspicion, but with confusion. No one had ever stayed this long. Not her family. Not old friends. Not even her ex-husband, who had disappeared before the twins turned 2. That evening, Ella asked if Matthew would read her a bedtime story, something she'd never asked anyone but her mother to do before. He smiled, nodded, and pulled a weathered children's book from the hospital's donated stack. He read with calm, careful rhythm while Ella curled up on a couch cushion, eyes half closed, lips slightly parted in that peaceful way children sometimes fall asleep, with full trust and no guard. When the story ended, Lauren looked at him from across the room. "She's starting to think of you like family," she said quietly. Matthew didn't hesitate. "That doesn't scare me." Lauren didn't reply at first. She looked at Ella, then at June. Then finally, she looked at him. "It scares me," she whispered. He nodded, not dismissing it. "That's okay. You've had to do everything alone for too long. But maybe it doesn't have to be that way anymore." Lauren sat down beside him, resting her arms on her lap. The exhaustion had turned into something quieter now, an ache she no longer tried to hide. "If you mean this," she said, "you have to understand, this isn't temporary. These girls, they'll remember." Matthew looked at her, and there was no hesitation in his voice. "So will I." They didn't speak much after that. The hospital room returned to its quiet lull, but something had shifted. It was unspoken and fragile, but it was there. The beginning of trust. The beginning of something neither of them had expected. On the 6th day, the city outside the hospital finally began to show signs of spring. The trees that lined the streets below the windows were touched with early green, and the air had a lightness to it that hadn't been there even a few days before. Inside June's hospital room, however, time moved differently. It was a place where growth and seasons didn't matter, where each second was measured not in sunlight or calendar dates but in heartbeats and breathing patterns and the color of a child's skin. That morning, Matthew arrived earlier than usual, carrying warm muffins from a bakery that had just opened down the street. He placed them gently on the windowsill and stepped over to the bedside, his eyes immediately scanning June's face. She looked the same, peaceful, pale, too still. But then something changed. As he reached for her hand, he noticed her fingers twitch slightly beneath his palm. For a moment, he thought he'd imagined it. He leaned in closer, watching her face, waiting. Another faint movement followed, her lips parted ever so slightly as if she were searching for air or words or maybe a dream. He called for a nurse, not loudly, but urgently. Lauren, who had stepped out just minutes before to make a phone call, returned in time to see 2 nurses leaning over June, gently checking her vitals, adjusting the monitors, and speaking in calm, clipped tones. Then the doctor came in, reviewed the charts, examined her carefully, and offered a tired but hopeful smile. "It's small," he said, "but it's a good sign. Her body's waking up. We don't know how soon or how clearly she'll regain consciousness, but this is progress." Lauren's knees nearly gave out. She sank into the chair beside the bed and held June's hand with both of hers, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Ella climbed onto the edge of the bed, clutching her sister's arm as if afraid she might disappear again. And Matthew stood quietly in the corner, watching this family that had somehow become his, feeling something inside him settle for the first time in years. The doctor's words echoed in the room long after he left. Hope had returned, but it brought with it uncertainty. Would June remember everything? Would there be complications? Would she be the same little girl who had run through hospital halls with her sister just days before? The next few days blurred together as the family stayed close. Matthew noticed that he no longer felt like a guest or an outsider. The nurses no longer asked who he was. Lauren no longer looked surprised when he appeared. Even Ella now reached for his hand automatically when walking down the corridor. The three of them began to fall into a rhythm, a life that had slowly reshaped itself around hospital walls and a single room where everything that mattered was waiting to wake up. That evening, Lauren finally asked him the question she'd been carrying since the second day. It came quietly, almost casually, while they sat on the bench outside the ICU and watched the city lights flicker through the window. "Why are you really doing this?" she said, her voice steady but uncertain. "You've built your life around control, success, distance. Why us? Why now?" Matthew turned toward her, resting his elbows on his knees and clasping his hands. He didn't answer right away because he wanted to find the words that would be honest. He had spent most of his adult life avoiding questions like this, anything too close to vulnerability. But this wasn't a press conference or a boardroom. "Because when I saw her," he said finally, "lying there, so small and fragile, and when I saw Ella begging for help, something broke inside me. I realized I was tired. Tired of living in a world where everything I built was only about me. I've had money, power, status, none of it made me feel what I felt when that little girl took my hand." Lauren listened silently, watching his face for cracks in the armor. There were none. Just truth. Just quiet conviction. And for the first time, she didn't question his reasons. Back in the hospital room, Ella had fallen asleep beside her sister again, curled into the space between the wall and the mattress like it was the most natural place in the world to be. Matthew and Lauren sat together in silence until the nurse came in to dim the lights. Before they left the room for the night, Matthew leaned over June and whispered something to her so softly that only she could hear it, even if she couldn't yet understand it. "I'm here. Whenever you're ready, I'll be here." And as they stood in the doorway one last time before heading to the waiting lounge, June's eyelids fluttered. Once. Then again. A soft, almost imperceptible sigh escaped her lips. The monitor beeped. Nothing dramatic, nothing sudden, just a gentle reminder that she was still fighting her way back. And they would all be there when she returned. By the seventh day, the hospital room felt less like a place of crisis and more like a sacred pause in time. The constant anxiety that had once filled every breath began to thin, replaced slowly with cautious optimism. June's progress had been small but steady, flutters of her eyelids, slight turns of her head, the beginning of movement in her fingers. It wasn't dramatic, but for her family, it was everything. Each twitch was a lifeline, a promise that the little girl they loved was still in there, finding her way back. Matthew arrived early again, this time carrying a puzzle book for Ella and a thermos of hot tea for Lauren. He found them just as he had the past few mornings, Lauren sitting by June's bed, brushing her daughter's hair with a plastic comb, and Ella sprawled on the bench, talking to her bear in a whisper. The soft golden morning light streamed through the high windows, catching in the strands of June's blonde hair and casting the whole room in a quiet glow. Today felt different, heavier with possibility. Lauren looked up when Matthew entered, her eyes tired but softer than before. She took the tea without a word, but her hand brushed against his briefly as she did, and that small touch said more than she could have spoken. He sat in the same chair as always, on the opposite side of the bed, and watched the rise and fall of June's chest. For a few minutes, no one spoke. The silence was no longer strained. It was shared. Then, slowly, June's eyelids lifted. Not in a flicker or a reflex, but in a way that was deliberate, searching. Her eyes didn't focus right away, and her expression was dazed, confused. Lauren let out a gasp, barely managing to hold herself back from crying out. She leaned closer, whispering June's name, brushing her hand along her daughter's cheek. June blinked, just once, and her lips parted. A sound, soft and hoarse, escaped her throat. It wasn't a word, but it was unmistakably her voice. Ella jumped up, knocking her bare to the floor. June, she called, nearly tripping over her shoes in her rush to get to the bed. Matthew reached out instinctively and steadied her with one arm as she pressed her tiny hands against her sister's. June blinked again, her gaze slowly moving across the room, and when it landed on Ella, something shifted in her face, recognition. She sees me. Ella cried. She sees me. Lauren was weeping now, openly, holding June's hand and murmuring to her through sobs. Nurses came rushing in, called by the change in vitals, and soon the room was filled with medical voices and quick movements. But through it all, June didn't cry. She simply lay there, her gaze drifting between the faces around her, confusion giving way to calm. Her eyes finally settled on Matthew, and for a second, it felt like everything else in the room stopped moving. She looked at you, Lauren said softly, almost in disbelief. Matthew's chest tightened. She remembers something. Maybe she just feels safe, Lauren replied. Maybe that's all she needs to remember right now. The doctor arrived, asked questions, ran tests, and explained that it might take days, or weeks, for June to speak clearly or recall events. But she was back. And that was the miracle they had been waiting for. Later that afternoon, when the room had quieted again, Lauren pulled Matthew aside near the nurse's station. Her face was raw from crying, but her posture had changed. She stood straighter now, no longer folding into herself. She didn't thank him this time. She didn't apologize. She just said, "You saved her. I know the doctors did their jobs, but she came back because she wasn't alone. Because you stayed." Matthew didn't know what to say. For a moment, he just looked at her, wondering how life had led him to this moment. He had started this week as a man consumed by business, by ambition, by endless noise. Now, the most important part of his day was the stillness of a child's breath returning after silence. "You saved all of us," she added. "Even me." He shook his head. "You were never the one who needed saving." Lauren smiled, but it was bittersweet. "We all do. Some of us just forget how to ask." That night, as they dimmed the lights and tucked Ella into the hospital cot beside her sister's bed, June's hand moved to clasp her twins. Her breathing was steady, her eyes closed, and her body finally at rest. Matthew sat nearby, Lauren beside him, neither speaking, both just watching. There was nothing more to say. They had survived the longest week of their lives. And though June's road to full recovery was just beginning, none of them would walk it alone. The days that followed June's awakening moved gently, like the first warm breeze after a harsh winter. Her body, once limp and unresponsive, began to stretch and shift with small, purposeful movements. Her eyes no longer stared blankly at the ceiling but followed her mother, her sister, and even Matthew with quiet curiosity. She didn't speak at first. The doctors had warned that speech might take time to return fully, but there was a light behind her gaze that hadn't been there before, and it told everyone that she was truly back. Lauren's days became a blend of new hope and cautious routine. She helped June relearn simple things, gripping a crayon, lifting a spoon, sitting up with support. Matthew remained by their side, never overstepping but always present. He brought new clothes for the girls, books for June that mirrored the ones she used to love, and a whiteboard for her to scribble on when she couldn't yet find the words. Ella had taken to sitting beside her sister every evening and reading aloud with such animated voices that nurses often paused outside their door to smile at the sound. One afternoon, June lifted her hand, placed it on Ella's arm, and quietly whispered her name. It was the first word she had spoken since waking up. Ella's eyes widened, her face glowing with disbelief and joy. She ran to Lauren, shouting with excitement, dragging her mother into the room. When Lauren asked June to say it again, June managed a soft, fragile, "Mama." That single word dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. Lauren knelt at the edge of the bed and sobbed against her daughter's hand while Matthew stepped out of the room to give them space. He stood in the hallway, leaning against the wall, blinking hard, unable to stop the wave of emotion that washed over him. He didn't know when exactly he had stopped thinking of them as someone else's family. Somewhere between that first terrified moment behind his office and this quiet miracle, they had become his. In the days that followed, he met Lauren's boss and quietly ensured her job remained safe, with paid time off for as long as she needed. He spoke with a foundation he supported and arranged private therapists and rehabilitation specialists to work with June. Everything he did, he offered without condition. And every time he did, Lauren no longer resisted. She had stopped seeing him as a stranger, or even as a benefactor. He had become something else entirely, someone she could lean on without shame. June grew stronger. Her laughter returned in small bursts, usually triggered by Ella's silliness or the absurd faces Matthew made during story time. The hospital room that once felt like a prison now seemed to hold the beginning of something new. One evening, just before sunset, Lauren stepped outside with Matthew to the small hospital courtyard while Ella played nearby with chalk and June sat in a wheelchair watching her with sleepy eyes. "I never thought this week would end like this," Lauren said. She looked at Matthew with a strange mixture of gratitude and sadness. "A part of me keeps waiting for something to go wrong. Like this is too much to hope for." Matthew looked at her and said gently, "Hope is the only reason we're standing here." She nodded, then turned her eyes away. "What happens next?" It was a question that had hovered between them all week. He hadn't pressed her for answers, hadn't pushed for anything more than what she was ready to give. But now, hearing it from her, he knew he had permission to speak truthfully. "I want to be there," he said. "For all of it. Not because I feel responsible or because I'm trying to save anyone. But because I care. About June. About Ella. About you." Lauren didn't speak for a long time. She looked at the girls. She listened to the soft breeze moving through the trees. And then, without looking at him, she said, "Okay." He reached for her hand and she let him take it. Weeks later, June was discharged. There was a small celebration with nurses and staff who had watched her transformation with wonder. Matthew rode with them to their small apartment and helped carry June up the steps. The place was modest, lived in, full of warmth. That night, they ate dinner together around Lauren's tiny kitchen table, chicken soup, crackers, juice, and laughed at nothing and everything. Matthew hadn't expected to find a new life by stumbling into a moment of crisis. But that was exactly what happened. He didn't just help them, they changed him. They reminded him that power meant nothing if it wasn't used to lift others. That love wasn't something you earned, it was something you gave, over and over, until it grew roots. In the end, it was never about being a hero. It was about showing up. And he did, every single day. This story's ending speaks to something quietly powerful, the idea that love, healing, and family can be born from the most unexpected moments of chaos. What began as a shocking encounter outside a high-rise office transformed into a deeply human journey, one that challenged pride, softened hardened routines, and reminded every character, and us as readers, that no one is truly self-made. We all need each other. What I appreciate most is how the story doesn't rush redemption. June's recovery is slow, Lauren's trust is hard-earned, and Matthew's transformation isn't about grand gestures, it's about presence, patience, and showing up even when there's no script. That's what makes the ending feel earned and believable, not just a fairy tale. The emotional payoff is satisfying not because everything becomes perfect, but because everyone chooses to keep trying. And sometimes, that's the most beautiful ending of all.